How did we get here? On one hand, we have a film about bashing men generating over $1 billion, and on the other hand, we have men speaking about masculinity getting cancelled. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound very equal. In fact, it raises a question I think many of us had on our lips. Does modern society hate masculinity? At the surface, it definitely seems like this is the case, but like most things, it's pretty complicated. So in this video, I want to try to understand what is happening and discover why it seems like there's a war on masculinity. Afterwards, you may have a new perspective that recenters you to what you can actually control. I had a lot of problems with the Barbie movie, but one of the things that really rubbed me the wrong way was the lens they presented men through. You know, soldiers of the patriarchy. Men are sexist, misogynistic, toxic, and are the sole threat to women's rights, opportunities, and safety. I obviously don't agree with this. If I did, I wouldn't be making this video. But I can see why Greta Gerwig has taken this stance. I'll give you some examples. The earliest set of laws we have found is Hammurabi's Code, from the ancient city of Babylon some 6,000 years ago. The code describes two genders, men and women, and three classes of people, slaves, commoners, and superior people. Hammurabi's Code is where the concept of an eye for an eye comes from. By studying these penalties, scholars have actually determined what the value of people were. The life of a common man was worth 60 silver coins, whereas the life of a common woman was worth 30 silver coins. This is not just a remnant of the past either. Girls in ancient Greece could not get an education. They could not participate in government. Coffee houses in Europe during the Enlightenment were seen as penny universities, a hub for social, political, technological, and intellectual discussion, regardless of class. But to enter, you had to be a man. During the 1960s, the amount of women in the New York Philharmonic Orchestra was 0%. In one decade, it increased to 10%. Why? They started to do blind auditions. And in one more decade, women became 50% of new hires. Now, musicians in the orchestra are 55% women. These are just a few examples from different areas of history highlighting the imbalance of opportunities between men and women. So when you look at these examples, it's very easy to present this view of the world. Men have always had it good and women have been fighting to catch up. This is of course a skewed view of reality. For most of human history, life sucked. For everyone. The history of humankind is a history of tragedy, and more recently, triumph. Imagine a world with no medicine. One infection could end your life. Imagine a world with no food security. Starvation was a daily activity most people had to endure. Imagine a world where skirmishes between your neighbor was a daily part of life. Life was shit for everyone, but as we started to solve more problems, life began to improve for both men and women. So what does this have to do with masculinity? Well, first we had to be on the same page about what masculinity actually means. But let's not get too bogged down in the definition of things. Masculinity is the qualities or attributes regarded as characteristic to boys and men. It's an umbrella term. These qualities are both characterized by biology and also culture. It's actually pretty complicated, but let's try to keep things simple here. When we look at history through time and across different cultures, we see three qualities that are consistently characterized as masculine. They are being a provider, being a protector, and being a patriarch, or leader. These are the three P's. I know there is some resistance to these terms at the moment, but stick with me here, I will explain where I'm going with this. To be competent in each of the P's, there is a certain criteria men have to meet. While being a provider, protector, and patriarch are still the expectations of men today. Because the world has developed, the criteria for each of these have slightly changed. These changes in criteria have made it more difficult for men to be providers, to be protectors, and to be a patriarch. Now, I recommend you giving this video a watch. It'll give you a good idea how life improved across every dimension for people, but also for women. Lives for women are vastly different now in 2023. Modern women now outnumber men at university. They can get jobs in fields they are interested in, but most importantly, they can now earn their own income. These are amazing things. I think we all can agree on that. But the elevation of women has also led to greater expectations of men. If I separated men and women into two groups and ranked them on a masculinity scale in terms of the 3 Ps, from most competent to least competent, the rankings of early civilization would look something like this. There will be some overlap between the really masculine girls and the not so masculine boys, but overall there would be a clear difference between the two sexes. This is not to say women could not be providers, protectors, or leaders, but structuring societies patriarchally had been what had worked best for all cultures during these time periods. I don't want to get into the reasons why. This is a video about why it appears there's a war on masculinity, not the differences between masculinity and femininity, the strengths and weaknesses of the two. Talking about that here would make this video too long and too complex. So if you're interested in that video, let me know in the comments. Anyway, the world has moved on from those time periods. Today, you provide for yourself by having your own income. If you have money, you can buy basically anything that you want. You don't have to worry about food, clothes, housing, education, gear for school or work, or just having fun. The entire world opens up to you if you have a decent income in a free market. This is why we hear some women say,
"So us women can supply for ourselves now."
Which leads into the second P, protecting. Traditionally, men had the responsibility of protecting women and children in the family or tribe. That is still true today, but marauders are far less common now than ever before. I can't speak for you, but personally, I have only ever needed to protect myself physically a few times in my life. Life has become so civilized that when things go wrong, it makes the news. Since we have built entire systems to protect individuals, there is no longer immediate danger to protect women and children from. I am, of course, speaking generally. Bad things happen all the time, and there are certainly bad people among us, but my point is that is not the normal. And because that's not the normal, some girls will say,
I just don't care about guys. You guys aren't really here for me, so.
Which brings me to the third P, patriarch. To be a leader, you have to be someone that other people want to follow, which means you have to exhibit qualities that others admire. By definition, you have to be better than them. You will not admire someone you believe is beneath you. There is another way to lead, of course. Become a tyrant, rule with an iron fist. But we know it doesn't work. It doesn't work for chimps, and it doesn't work for us. Compare Mufasa to Scar in The Lion King. On one hand, you have the good father that is well respected and admired by everyone. And on the other hand, you have this toxic uncle that we universally don't like. In fact, if you meet someone who likes Scar, get away from that person. Because people have fortunately been elevated in terms of well-being, wealth, and opportunities, the bar for admiration has been risen so high. To be a leader in the modern world, you have to be in this upper echelon of people, which is a difficult thing to do. So the current masculine totem pole will look something like this. Pretty even between the two sexes, but with some deviation at the extremes. So while society is very different, the expectations of men being the 3 Ps has remained the same. We see this in dating preferences.
When it comes to dating, what do you look for in a guy then?
Oh God, so much.
I thought you just said, men should just be themselves.
They should be themselves, but sometimes themselves is not gonna cut it for me.
Women typically want a man who can support them financially and emotionally. She wants to feel safe in his presence, and she also wants him to be a leader, not a tyrant. You are welcome to push back against this if you like, but I don't see any evidence otherwise. And it's always more helpful to pay attention to what people do more so than what they say. This is not just women's desires either. Men also aspire and expect each other to become more competent in these areas. Both men and women have been wired this way through evolution. We can clearly see this in the neurochemistry of pair bonding, in particular the oxytocin and vasopressin pathway. Since the average woman has now become comparable to the average man on the masculine totem pole, and she's only looking up, all the men beneath her become forgotten. And that's where Andrew Tate and the manosphere comes in. Tate has become the spokesman of the downtrodden men, the men who feel underappreciated, undervalued, and invisible to society. They feel as if their problems and their struggles don't matter, and they are just expected to suck it up. You can see this in the Barbie movie too. When the female characters share their problems, the audience is expected to meet them with empathy. In contrast, when the male characters share their problems, they are met with laughs. It just felt very odd. When men feel this way, what response do you think these men will have? First, you have the men who take responsibility for the situation they are in, and genuinely want to become better men so they can live more fulfilling lives. That's you, by the way. But this is the internet and there's no place for reasonable people, so let's move on to the next group. You can play the blame game and identify an enemy, in this case, women. You have entire communities of men taking aim at women as the cause of these problems. We will call these people incels. Or you may join a group of men withdrawing from the dating market completely because all women suck. So how do you solve this problem as boys are starting to fall behind their female peers? There is a solution put forward by some of the more radical types. A return to more traditional values. A return to a time when women were beneath men on the masculine totem pole. They are calling for the regression of women's rights and opportunities. The advocates of this are not just men, there are some women calling for it too. This is a genuine fear that the left woke feminists have, and it's portrayed in the Barbie movie as well. After discovering the patriarchy in the real world, Ken returns to Barbie Land to restore order, a restoration to a more traditional time, where men rule and women are domesticated. This idea that women should not have hopes, dreams, aspirations, and their roles is to simply serve their boyfriends and family. It's a simple solution to the problem, and not a good one. Putting aside the ethical and moral reasons, it doesn't even make sense economically, but that could be another video. So I want you to now imagine you're the CEO of one of these big media companies. You are going to surround yourself with people who share similar beliefs to what you have. Simon Sinek in his book Start With Why makes the case that people buy why you do something, not what you do. They buy into your company because they believe the same thing you believe. And so your shareholders are likely to have the same beliefs as your company does. Now let's say a figure emerges that appear to be a threat to your beliefs. This figure is gaining a following and their influence is growing. You found a weed in your garden. So what are you going to do? You remove the weed, you silence the threat, and you have monetary incentive to cancel them because your shareholders have the same beliefs you do. Now I'm not saying Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson are weeds. Some of the things they say are definitely questionable, but ultimately they are just another plant in the garden with different ideas. But because it is a human tendency to operate from a place of fear, these people get perceived as weeds that are competing for the land in the garden, and so they get cancelled. As I have talked about in previous videos, this is a poor response because it sets up these two groups as enemies, and then they only become more polarized and more cemented in their beliefs. At that point, we form groups of people that hate each other. So that's an overview of the situation that we're in and how we got here. You need to keep in mind that I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. These are my thoughts on the topic after reading books, reading studies, listening to podcasts from experts, interacting with both sides, and connecting the dots for myself. I will stand behind my arguments, but I am also open to learning. So if any of you believe you have a better argument, please let me know. Now, I promised at the start of this video I will recenter this conversation to something we can actually control. The first thing is to shift your mindset by identifying what the problem actually is. I don't see a war on masculinity as such. I see a culture terribly confused about what it means to be a man and woman in the modern world. Our culture has more or less welcomed women into the masculine domain. In fact, it is encouraged to the extent that it has become detrimental to stay-at-home mums. The same is not true for men though. Men have not been welcomed into the feminine domain. There is a lack of male teachers in schools for this reason. It just isn't seen as a masculine occupation, which is a damn shame. You will see Andrew Tate-like characters presenting one view on masculinity, then others presenting an opposite view. And you will see many other opinions somewhere in between these two. The world has never been in this position before. We don't know what we're doing and we're working it out as we go. Humans are emotional, and this dispute about gender roles and the dynamic between men and women going into the new world will be messy. That is to be expected. I have my own opinions about gender roles and such, which I will share if I make a video about masculinity and femininity. With that said, what should we do going forward with our lives? Use the Barbie movie as an example of what not to do. This movie is a comedy. It's meant to be satirical, but it really missed the mark. The Barbie movie was like, we know young men are demoralized, so here's some salt for your wounds. Uplifting women does not need to mean pushing men down. All it achieves is further animosity between men and women. To stop this cycle of hate as individuals, look at Lex Fridman's conversation with Kanye West. Kanye was explaining how he was screwed over by Jews, but Lex pushed back and said, no, you weren't screwed over by Jews, you're screwed over by shitty individuals. Have the courage to call out the individuals, not the group. That is absolutely true. I have been hurt by women in the past. Every man has. Does that mean that I'm going to hate women as a class of people? No. I'll be doing myself a disservice. Just think about all the experiences I will be denying myself. The narrative needs to move away from man and women as opposing forces and into a story about a love for each other. Yes, in history, women were perceived to be less than men, but you need to keep in mind that this was at the cultural level. Rightfully or wrongfully, this was a shared belief both men and women had at that time. It does not necessarily mean that all women were treated poorly by all men. I think that is so unlikely it is near impossible. What I think is far more likely is men and women standing together, solving problems, doing the impossible through love and cooperation for each other. Consider this crazy idea. For all human history, men had the expectation of being providers, protectors, and patriarchs. If a man could provide, protect, and lead, then he would be a desirable partner for mating. The process of natural selection is competitive. This means the world men have created was created to provide, protect, and to lead women. Everything men do at the end of the day is for women. This is not to say men got everything right. Far from it, in fact. If you read this book, Invisible Women by Caroline Perez, you'll see how this world has been designed by men for women without the input from women. Not consulting women has led to the formation of unique problems facing women that men would not consider, simply because we do not have the data. So I would argue this should be the role of modern day feminism. Instead of focusing on beating men down and fixating on pay gaps, your goal should be closing the data gap. This will shift the conversation away from being a pity contest to something actually constructive. So yeah, that's all I have for you in this video. There's a lot more to discuss, particularly around masculinity and femininity. So if there's enough interest, I'll make a video about that too. The key takeaway is what we are witnessing is a natural part of change. It is going to be messy and unproductive until we come to an agreement about what dynamic works best. It might be painful, but I'm confident we'll get there eventually. Until then, I'm going to criticize individuals, not hate groups of people. I will be approaching women with a genuine sense of love because they can enhance my experience of life, and I recommend you to do the same. Alright, thanks for watching. I appreciate you. See you in the next one.